Good afternoon. I'm Christina Elson, the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Capitalism at Wake Forest University. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of a series of panels where we'll discuss the implications of the pandemic and economic crisis for well-functioning capitalism. If you'd like to learn more about this series, please go to capitalism.wfu.edu to find more information on the series, and also you'll find ways to join our social media community. Today's topic is, can rights remain the same in the new normal? Individual freedom is a necessary condition for democratic capitalism. The pandemic has resulted in numerous violations by all levels of government and of traditional rights, such as the freedom to assemble. More worryingly for some is the potential long-term impact to individual freedom if this event generates certain kinds of action by governments and businesses around mass data collection about our movements and our health. Additionally, the potential spate of lawsuits against business and government as they struggle to balance safety, privacy, and the economic reality of the pandemic is something of concern to many. Joining me today are 5 distinguished panelists. John Allison is Executive Fellow of the Center for the Study of Capitalism. He is the retired CEO and President of the Cato Institute and retired CEO and Executive Chairman of BB&T. Thank you, John, for joining us.
Pleasure.
Jeff Bucholtz is a partner at King & Spalding Law Firm. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Ethan Davis is Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Ethan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Ilya Shapiro is Director of the Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Ilya, thank you for joining us today.
With you.
Let me just briefly set up our discussion. There are a number of standards for evaluating restrictions on human rights. For example, Human Rights Watch suggests that restrictions can at times be justified when they have a legal basis. They are based on scientific evidence. They are not applied in arbitrary or discriminatory fashions. They have a limited duration and have some review process associated with them. A country like China, for example, would not meet this standard because it withheld information from the public and the scientific community. It downplayed the severity of the pandemic, and it, detained and censored people in discussions. So Ilya, let me direct the first question to you. What framework makes sense for the U.S., and how does the federal government think about balancing the need to respond to a public health emergency with the need to protect our constitutional rights?
Yeah, that's the 64, I guess not 1,000 anymore, but $1 billion question, right? The first thing you have to think about is what you read from Human Rights Watch. That is generally, in layman's terms or in policy terms, what needs to be thought about. When you translate that to the legal sphere and in terms of political institutions, in the American system, there's 2 things to consider: federalism and the separation of powers. So first of all, it's not simply the federal government, not simply Washington or any branch within it, whether the president, the executive branch, or anyone else, that is controlling all of the policy response to the pandemic. And so the federal government has power over interstate commerce, could close airports, for example, hasn't done that. Certain statutory authorities under the Defense Production Act and others to change the rules for government contracting to facilitate the production and requisition of ventilators and things like that. But most of it is in the purview of the states, and that's why the shelter-in-place orders, the shutdown orders, the various restrictions that people talk about, that's all been done by governors and mayors. And those govern pursuant to what's called the police power to regulate for the general health, safety, and welfare. And that's not unlimited either. It's subject to kind of a constitutional smell test. In this case, there's a general acceptance that on the soundest epidemiological data that we had 2.5 months ago, we're all potentially spreaders of infection. And so limiting that activity made sense. But again, that's not unlimited. And now we're seeing challenges and successful challenges, both in terms of state constitutional and administrative law about the separation of powers, whether the governors are exercising their powers too much or too long, and with specific challenges. Why are you keeping open drive-in liquor stores but not churches, for example? So there are those checks and balances, and there's both the separation of powers horizontally among different branches and vertically between the federal and the state governments.
Ethan, let me bring you in here. From the perspective that you're seeing on the ground, working through these questions every day, what can you add?
Sure. So, we are in a global public health crisis. And as the Attorney General has put it, that crisis has required the imposition of extraordinary restrictions on all of our daily lives. We've all been living through many different restrictions that we never would have dreamed just a few months ago would ever be necessary. But even in times of emergency, when reasonable and temporary restrictions may be placed on rights, those rights don't disappear altogether. And I'll tell you how I've seen that play out from my spot in the civil division. One of our roles here in the civil division is to take enforcement actions against companies and individuals who market fake tests or treatments for COVID-19. And our consumer protection branch here in civil has a variety of tools at its disposal, including civil injunctions and criminal prosecutions. And in deciding when to take enforcement actions, we've tried to balance the need to respond vigorously to a public health crisis with a respect for individual liberty and private sector innovation. So we could have taken a very aggressive approach and decided to pursue anyone who sells a treatment that hasn't been officially approved by the FDA. That would have been easy to apply and straightforward, but it would have been counterproductive because it would have stifled important innovation and because it would have put overbroad restrictions on individual liberty. So instead, we've been careful not to pursue companies and individuals who are trying in good faith to develop innovative treatments, even if those treatments haven't been officially approved by the FDA. So our enforcement actions are laser focused on actual fraud, on people and companies who are allegedly selling obviously fake cures like ozone therapy, industrial bleach, and silver products to treat COVID-19. I mean, that balance may be hard to strike at times since it's sometimes not immediately obvious whether a treatment is fake or not, but we believe it's the right principle and the one we think protects individual liberty to the maximum extent possible, even in the middle of a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. John, can I get your thoughts? Are there specific violations that you feel have been warranted or unwarranted in terms of how this has played out?
Well, I think there have been a lot of unwarranted violations, often instituted by either state governments or even local communities. As an example, I live in North Carolina. The community of Hatteras closed their whole area to entry from people that owned homes that had been paying taxes in that area for 20 years. I don't know where they should get the authority to do that. I will say this, I hope we will use this experience as a lesson on what the constraints ought to be going forward. Who can do what, and how long the actions can be. This has been a long time, and it's done very serious damage to our economy. It's not a free issue, and it's been some pretty significant violations of individual rights if we were having normal times. I want to make one context issue just for the group of people that are watching. I happen to be on a commission looking at reopening the economy, and we have some very interesting statistics now. The median age of individuals in the United States who have died from this pandemic is 81 years old. And almost all the people that have died have pre-existing conditions. So for people under 60 in good health, this is a lot lower risk than most flus we've had over the last 20 years. So did we, people argue we dealt too slow. I think we may have dealt too fast until we really started getting the statistics and who we should have focused on is older people with health problems. And I think that has to do with the government taking a lot of actions that might not be justified based on the facts, and we didn't necessarily get the facts before we started acting.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, your question asked, how should the government balance the need to respond to the pandemic with individual rights? And I guess if the government's doing it right, then the question sort of suggests that there's a tension between the two, and certainly there can be. But if the government is doing this right, then the government is responding to the pandemic in a way that ultimately promotes and protects the exercise of individual rights rather than impinges on them. There's a famous line from Justice Jackson, albeit in dissent in the Supreme Court generations ago, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And that's a line that sounds good. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. But what he meant by it is that case was about free speech and the line between free speech and incitement to violence and what could be punished and what was protected. His point was the choice is not between liberty with order. Is not between liberty versus order. It's between liberty with order and anarchy with neither liberty nor order. That's a different point than in a pandemic, but the same basic principle applies, right? I think if the government is doing things in good faith and with a healthy sense of its own limitations, with a healthy sense of respect for constitutional rights, with a healthy sense of respect for federalism, and what science doesn't know yet, then the government can respond to the pandemic in a way that really does genuinely protect people and enable them to go on exercising their constitutional rights. That's easy to say at a level of generality like that and hard to implement in practice, but I did want to just sort of take on the assumption that there's inevitably a conflict between protecting individual rights and responding to the pandemic. There have been examples where I think that conflict has been real, unfortunately, but I'd like to think that over time, the government will strike that balance right in a way that actually doesn't really hurt either side.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because going back, hindsight is always 20/20, and so there were many things that initially we didn't know about the mortality rate of the pandemic, or who it was going to impact, or how it would impact people. Unfortunately, some of the initial data we got out of China was not very helpful. So looking at what happened, many leaders did decide to err on the side of caution, but going forward, what is it that we maybe have learned from this experience, given that it may take time sometimes to understand what happens with these, what can happen in these situations that we may not have, it may take a while for us to really understand the true nature of what we're dealing with. John, let me ask you for your thoughts on that. So what can we do better in the future?
I think first thing, we should be more generally prepared, which we were not. Just like we prepare for wars, you can prepare for issues of health issues, particularly in today's world where these viruses can spread very rapidly. And we were not prepared. We hadn't really thought about the risk that was involved with. Second, I think we need to be very specific about what authorities various governmental entities have. I agree that this is primarily a state problem under our Constitution, but even in the case of states and certainly in localities, there ought to be restrictions on what they can do. And thirdly, I think we need hard evidence. I mean, we don't declare war unless we have evidence. And I think we had a lot of confusing evidence, and we had a lot of crazy projections in retrospect that probably an objective look at would have said they were crazy in the first place. And based on those projections, we reacted. And so I think it's kind of like anything that's unexpected. Once it's happened, you should start getting more prepared. I think businesses will, by their very nature, start getting more prepared. I don't think very many businesses were prepared. It was kind of something that most business leaders hadn't thought about. But I think also at the governmental level, we ought to think about, if this happens again, what are we going to do, and what are the limitations on what we can do? I think we got to be cautious about throwing away individual rights, because sometimes it's very hard to put Pandora back in the box, and that does concern me.
Ethan, how can you respond to John's comments?
Sure. So I certainly agree with the need to be prepared. In terms of being prepared for a crisis that happens in the future, it's, there are limits to how much you can be prepared, and it's hard to strike a perfect balance in advance. On one hand, the government's responsibility is to protect the people from public health dangers that, we may not even know what the next public health danger might look like, and we may not know what sorts of measures might be necessary to deal with it. But on the other hand, the government also has a solemn responsibility to protect and secure individual liberty, and it's hard to know exactly how to strike that balance without knowing the specifics of what might arise. But that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. From the civil division's perspective, we apply a set of general principles that help distinguish between overbroad efforts and efforts that are really necessary to address a public health crisis. And as I mentioned before, we try to distinguish between enforcement efforts that are necessary to root out fraud and real threats to the public health, and enforcement efforts that really just chill private sector innovation. So we ask ourselves questions like, has this company or individual lied to consumers or to the government? Does this company's activities threaten to harm consumers? Or is the activity we're focused on just a purely regulatory violation that doesn't threaten any harm to health or safety? And I think having principles like that, and different principles for different parts of government, helps you think clearly about these crises when they do arise.
Jeff, what are you seeing? This raises a lot of questions regarding the role of the legal community in responding to the issues that Ethan is bringing up. What can you tell us there?
Well, a key part of our legal framework and a key part of any hope that the balance is going to get struck right is that the independent judiciary is going to play the significant role that it's supposed to play, in adjudicating disputes about, whether certain government measures, go too far or last too long or what have you. And I think what I do in a law firm representing clients in the private sector, there are obviously many clients right now, many companies in the private sector that are very concerned about a number of measures that local, state, and the federal government have taken. I think everyone understands that at the beginning of a crisis, when maybe you don't have good data yet, maybe you don't have a real understanding of the extent of the danger, you want government to act decisively. You don't want government to wait until it's too late to act. But it's really important to make sure that the restrictions don't last longer than they're needed. And we don't have to look too far around the world to see examples of governments that don't really believe in freedom, either economic or other kinds, using this crisis as an opportunity to clamp down in various ways. And I'm not suggesting that's happening here. I'm just suggesting that part of the reason it isn't and won't is that we have an independent judiciary that will take its job seriously. And if restrictions that might have been justified in the first place last longer than they're really justified, I think the courts will start striking them down. We've already seen some warnings from courts where, for the most part, courts haven't actually struck down lockdown measures or the like yet, although a few have. But a lot have said, this doesn't quite rise to the level of being irrational or being unconstitutional, and we're not going to strike it down now, but we're sending a shot across the bow to make sure everyone knows, this kind of thing can't last forever, and the government has to be careful in what it does. And so I think over time, as courts get more skeptical of restrictions that last longer and longer, and maybe are shown, to be unnecessary or to be counterproductive, that we'll see courts being more active in this, as they should be.
Is there a specific example that you've seen that you think is very borderline in terms of, the courts are responding with that warning that this is not something that should be continued, maybe indefinitely?
Well, I guess the warning that I would single out, not to single out the measure that was at issue, which I don't claim to know all the details of, but the Texas Supreme Court issued a decision a few weeks ago that got a lot of attention because I think it was 3 or 4 justices wrote a concurring opinion that said, we're not going to strike this down now, but we want the world to know that we're going to look really carefully at this stuff. And the government can't just, do whatever it wants and can't expect the courts to defer, blindly to whatever the government does. I mean, I'm reminded of, I was at the Justice Department shortly after 9/11 when the government started taking all sorts of actions in the war on terrorism that raised novel legal questions. And I'm reminded of the Supreme Court saying, memorably in one of those cases, the war on terrorism is not a blank check for the executive branch. And the same is true for a pandemic. And I think courts are going to, for a while say this is a closed case, but we're going to give the government the benefit of the doubt for the time being. But as governments show that they deserve less of the benefit of the doubt by not lifting restrictions when they should or going beyond what they should, once we understand all this better, than we did at first, then I think we'll see courts being more assertive.
Yeah. Ilya, as you're looking at the balance and the relationship between state and local governments and the federal government, what are you seeing in terms of how that is unfolding? Right.
The justification for powers changes over time, not because constitutional meaning changes, but because the underlying facts do. And when you're talking about this general police power to regulate for health and safety, as we learn about morbidity rates, as we learn about things like being outside is apparently good, closing parks and outdoor recreational facilities seems much less justified than it was 2.5 months ago when we didn't do anything. And sure, you have precautionary principle, but over time, even apart from the state constitutional limits on a governor being able to do something without the legislature having a say, or certain things that mayors can do, a lot of these restrictions just need to be more nuanced and more tailored. I saw closing off certain aisles for so-called non-essential goods, for example, or closing so-called non-essential businesses. Well, what does that mean? Shouldn't we be talking about safe and unsafe? If what is scientifically indicated is social distancing, and there are still debates about whether 6 feet is really what's necessary. Some European countries have 1 meter, which is 3 feet, just over 3 feet. But if that's what's required, then you talk about things like limiting the number of people per square foot in a store, and having them go, follow an arrow down the aisles rather than closing certain parts of the store, closing certain stores, and not others. And again, similar for, I'm in Falls Church, Virginia, and I've actually having this micro battle with the mayor here. They in week 7 of the quarantine, they closed the tennis courts. Week 7, right? As everyone else was opening up, we're now in week 10, I believe. Not because of tennis playing, and I vowed not to approach the net at the same time as my opponent. It wasn't that. It was teenagers were congregating on the courts. Now, I doubt that the particular public courts that I use don't have like an open basketball court or parking lot, which is where teenagers tend to congregate. But regardless, if just saying, chaining the tennis courts, that is not going to stop teens from hanging out. So, targeted, nuanced, subtle policy measures, both as a matter of policy and, frankly, as I talked about, the constitutional smell test is what's at issue. And finally, even beyond the governmental powers, look, a lot of this is a question of popular legitimacy. And just as people stopped flying and people stopped going to restaurants long before there were official government shutdowns, with opening up as well, this is a rapidly changing and dynamic popular opinion. A few weeks ago, nobody wanted to go to restaurants. Now that's, we're all over the place on that sort of question. And so different kinds of decisions for the opening up are simply not going to be taken as legitimate. And the cops aren't going to be arresting people for everybody for violating them. So there's a very interesting balance here that we can see in real time as the legitimacy of laws change, the popular legitimacy changes just as their underlying constitutional justification does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at this point, a lot of parents would love to quarantine all the teens together and let them stay on the course. So this brings up a very interesting point related to moving from a framework of rules to thinking about norms of behavior. So John, let me ask you, many states have been looking for ways to to move away from mandates and to thinking about what kind of norms of behavior we should start trying to, get people to understand and follow. That, in some sense is perhaps more the approach that Sweden took to this at the beginning of the pandemic. But from your point of view, how important is this to do? Is this the right place to do it at the state level? And who should be showing leadership in this space of this movement to think about norms, establishing behavioral norms?
I definitely think at this stage, with the information we have now, norms of behavior are much more rational than arbitrary government edicts at any level. We have a lot more information about what's risky and what's not risky. A lot of the norms of behavior are pretty simple, like, having a reasonable distance, probably wearing masks, although that's debatable. A lot of them are just common sense if you're around somebody that might have the flu. And I think it's important to do that because I think we run the risk of what I call civil disobedience. In fact, we're seeing it a lot. We're seeing a lot of stores that are open that aren't supposed to be open, right? We're seeing a lot of people young people crowd into different kinds of facilities. And I think when you try to enforce things legally that people as a group don't support, you can get some very destructive long-term behavior that transcends this particular situation. So I think it's important to have guidelines. I think it's important to help people understand what the risks are if they don't follow these guidelines. I think it's important to let businesses decide, what they want to do in terms of the risks they take. If you go to a Costco versus a Walmart, you'll see very different standards of how they treat customers. But I don't think it makes any sense to crowd everybody into a handful of stores that are now allowed to be open, and they can't go into other stores, which would have a lot fewer people in it. And I think we will get some pushback later on in terms of the support of the law in general, when the laws seem arbitrary and they are not actually producing really good results. And as regards young people, as I said earlier, the risk seems to be pretty low. It's not zero risk, but they definitely, if you were 18 years old, 20 years old, 2 years ago, you were taking a lot more risk driving your car than you are today of having normal behavior in regards to this virus. The statistics are pretty clear about that right now.
So Ethan, how can, at the federal level, John brought up things like potential civil disobedience, potential local implementation based on what's happening on different landscapes. How difficult is that to manage, to manage and sort of try to understand what's working and not, and where you need to respond?
So on the question of how we interact with the state and local governments in managing this crisis, I have a few things to say. The Attorney General has made clear that the Constitution is not suspended in times of crisis. Like the federal government, state governments have to abide by the Constitution. And for that reason, the Attorney General recently directed the Assistant Attorney General for our Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan to oversee the federal government's efforts to monitor state and local policies that might infringe on constitutional and statutory protections. And our Civil Rights Division, which is a separate division from the one that I'm the principal deputy in, has filed briefs in cases where we think states have overstepped their bounds, and we have sent letters to state officials expressing concerns about particular policies. From the Civil Division's perspective, the COVID-19 crisis has actually offered a chance to engage in a kind of productive, cooperative federalism. We can partner with state governments to address fraud, fake test kits, and fake cures that we are unfortunately seeing throughout the country. When we see a fraudulent scheme, we'll either refer it to state or local authorities or pursue it ourselves. And the goal in this area is to make sure that the federal and state governments are pointed in the same direction. So it's a good news story on the Civil Division side.
Jeff, could I get your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the point that John was making, that if you have laws that don't make sense, that people realize don't make sense, they won't obey them, and having laws that go too far, last too long, don't make sense, promotes disrespect for the rule of law more broadly. And we have way, way, way too much law in this country. And I hope that this crisis doesn't, exacerbate that, what I already believe is a significant problem. On the other hand, and so I agree that it really would be good, and over time it will be necessary for us to move to more of a norm-based approach to managing the risks of this pandemic. The problem with that is that for that to work, you have to have a pretty good degree of shared understanding and belief about what those norms should be, because by definition, if they're just norms and not actual laws, you don't have to comply with them. And if people don't think that they make sense, they won't comply with them. And, you mentioned Sweden. I don't claim to be an expert on Sweden, but in all the articles I've read about it, you see people saying things to the effect of, the norm approach works in Sweden because people in Sweden trust the government. And if the government says it's a good idea to do something, we're not going to require you to do it because we respect your freedom, but we think it's a good idea to do it. That the vast majority of people will do it. Well, here, I just saw a study by Carnegie Mellon that said that something like half of the Twitter users promoting reopening were bots, not actual people. And, we have a severely divided public discourse on many things, including the pandemic. And, I'm not sure that it's realistic to expect the country, as sad as this is for me to say, anytime soon, to be in a position where enough people share the same views about what's appropriate and the same beliefs, and are even hearing the same information from different sources, for us to have a norm-based approach that really works. I hope I'm wrong about that, and over time, I think we have no choice but to move to a norm-based approach. But I think different societies can make that work in different ways.
Ilya, what do you think? Can a norm-based approach work in the U.S., or is it a regional question, or?
Well, we're sort of in a flux period where norms are establishing themselves and facts on the ground are changing. So we do need guidance. We do need some law, but the more that law is arbitrary, and as others have said, isn't respected, at that point it's we're going to coalesce around some sort of norms, and those might be different in different places. So the role of the soft power of government, locally and state, even more than federal, to indicate reason-based rules or guidelines to set those norms is important. Things like, we've all noticed that a lot of regulations have been waived or set aside during this period, and people are thinking, well, do we need to bring them all back? Whether it's occupational licensing or zoning restrictions, or all sorts of different hoops that you have to jump through to get things done. Well, if we want to relax them in a pandemic, well, what are we really giving up? So I think there's going to be a different understanding of the proper role of government in various ways, but we're in the middle of the storm now. It's we'll see where it all settles out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's move a little bit to things starting to settle out, because as we move into a reopening phase and we see that businesses are struggling with how they can reopen and what potential liability they may have in doing so, and how to manage their customers, and pretty much everything. My son went to the batting cage the other day, and he walked in, and the first thing they did was shove a waiver, which who knows where that came from. So this is the normal. I mean, you're a small business trying to open, and you have to print some waiver off the computer. In any case, I'm sure Jeff would find that horrifying, just printing waivers off of computers. But, so let me ask that question. There could be potential lawsuits and all sorts of liability issues, and how can we manage these if we need the American economy to come back strongly? What can we do to make sure that we're creating the right atmosphere? Jeff, let me just start with you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really important question. I think there's two distinguishing characteristics that maybe more, but two that I would highlight. One is, has already been mentioned, is our federal system. We're really quite different from most countries in the federal system that we have, which, in many respects is genius and one of the best parts of our system of government. In other ways, it complicates things because there's no one actor that can deal with all aspects of a problem or in all of its manifestations. And the second aspect I think that's distinguishing about our country compared to most other countries is the lawsuit culture that we have. I just think there's no comparison between the U.S. and most countries that in other respects are similar economically or culturally to the U.S. In terms of the prevalence of lawsuits here and the political power that plaintiffs' lawyers have. So, whether that's good or bad under normal circumstances is beyond the scope of today's discussion. But I do think that for the country to move ahead with reopening in a way that makes sense and that's doable for businesses who are actually taking the time to think about what the risks of reopening are and to try to manage them and do things right, we're going to need to implement some liability protection. And I actually, I'll give a shout out to Ethan and his colleagues at the Department of Justice, who I think, and the rest of the federal government, who I think are doing a good job of doing what they can under existing law to, implement liability protections in various ways. That Ilya mentioned the Defense Production Act earlier. There's a statute called the PrEP Act that was enacted in 2005, I think, that provides significant liability protection, but in certain areas. And there are various other, liability protections that exist or that the government is trying to, expand and apply in ways that are helpful here. But the existing array of liability protections is not, in my view, going to be adequate to protect businesses that we want to protect because we want to encourage them to reopen. And we can't expect them to reopen, if they face unlimited liability that they can't even insure, because if you're the insurer, you can't quantify it and you can't sell insurance to protect against it. So I do think something is going to be needed to provide additional liability protection. As I said, I think the government's doing what it can. The federal government, that is doing what it can, and many states are as well. But, liability protection is a very politically controversial issue in this country. Many states are supporting liability protection measures as a result of the pandemic, and many are not, depending on the nature of their state government. At the federal level, the Senate and the House are in quite different positions on those issues. And I don't know what the prospect is for legislation, but it sure would be good if politicians could work together right now and figure out a sensible regime of liability protection that would really help the country as a whole.
Ethan, let me come to you in a minute, but John, before I do that, let me ask you, in talking to businesses and working with the commissions, what are the kind of concerns that you're seeing that they do have in this area?
I think Jeff is absolutely right. Businesses, to get fully open, do need some kind of perception of liability protection. And of course, it's not just from their customers, it's from their own employees. Because they know there's a risk that one of their employees will get the virus while they're at work. So I think that's a big impediment to businesses really getting up and running full speed. And I think some kind of liability protection formula is very important if we're going to really get the economy going again and get these millions of people that aren't employed back in their jobs. This is an interesting example, and it's not just liability protection, but it is interesting. I went to get some blood work for a normal exam that I'm having, and I had to fill in about 18 forms, and they told me that they only had about 20% of the people that normally had blood work getting blood work. Well, that's not good, because there's some people that need to get the blood work not getting it. And I have a physician friend who's a cardiologist, does heart surgery. He told me that they're doing about half their normal level of heart surgery. That means people are having symptoms and choosing them to ignore them because of the bad information. And then the hospitals are super careful because they're afraid that they'll get sued if somebody comes in and happens to get the virus and can associate it in any way with the hospital. So I think you have a psychological issue on customer sides and employee sides to get the economy going. And I think businesses and hospitals or any kind of institution that might be sued are extremely cautious for the same reason.
Yeah. Ethan, how do you respond to the concerns that John and Jeff are bringing up?
So John and Jeff are exactly right that in order to bring our economy back, we are going to have to address the avalanche of potential liability that our businesses are going to face and really are already facing as they start to reopen their doors. And reopening a business after this pandemic should not come with unlimited liability risk. I mean, this is not the kind of crisis that was caused by anyone here. It just came out of the blue. And where there is widespread harm caused by these kinds of factors outside the control of any person or business, it is appropriate, we think, for the federal government to help mitigate the liability risks associated with operating productive commercial and civic activities. I mean, the government really should protect the core of our economy, American businesses, from threats that could overwhelm them as they get back to work. This is critical to protecting businesses here and jobs. It's critical to protecting our supply chain, the food and materials we all need to go about our lives. And it's critical, as my colleagues have said, to protecting our healthcare industry and the drugs and treatments that we need. And we have a great team of attorneys at the Justice Department who are focused on these issues and have been thinking about how DOJ and the administration can help in this effort. There are a couple of historical precedents. As Jeff mentioned, there's the PrEP Act in 2005, which was enacted in response to the avian flu. There's also the Y2K Act enacted at the turn of the century that was designed to respond to the perceived Y2K bug. So this is an important effort, and it's critical to making sure our economy can get back off the ground.
Ilya, last thoughts?
I don't really have anything to add to that. My colleague Walter Olson has been covering this very important beat for Cato, so check out his work.
Great, thank you. Any ideas about where you'd like us to be in a year from now? John, where would you like things to be a year from now?
Well, obviously, I'd like us to be back more normal. It'd be great if we had a vaccine, and I think we will by then. And I really hope we learn the right lessons. I'm concerned that this has been used to expand government on many fronts, and that it'll be hard to roll back that expansion of government. I think it is an opportunity to do exactly the opposite. And I'll have to credit President Trump on this Regulation Reduction Act. I think that's a great idea. What we're seeing is a lot of the regulations are counterproductive. If they're counterproductive in tough times, then aren't they counterproductive in good times? So I hope we will use this opportunity to learn the right lesson. I doubt we will, but I hope we will, and that we'll roll back the role of government and be very much more specific about what the government can do when there is a crisis and what gets defined as a crisis. What process do we have to go through? And how long can executives, can governors, can the president act before legislators are at least brought into the issue? You know, we have a lot of cases like in Michigan where the governor seems to have run off the rails, and yet there's no legislative action to get her back in at least the normal behavior of other governors. So I hope we'll learn the right lessons, which is about a lot, I think, about the limitations of government, the need for rule of law in terms of very specifics, and that individual rights matter. I think one of the classic issues is what's happened with religion. You know, denying people the right to express, I'm not very religious myself, but denying people the right to express their religious beliefs is clearly unconstitutional. It's very specific. And there really needs to be an extraordinary evidence of why that's necessary to do. So I hope we'll roll back regulations. We'll have less government and more specific government.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Final thoughts, Jeff, Ethan, Ilya?
I'll be really brief and echo what John said. I also think this is unlikely, but I'll say it anyway. I hope that this is an occasion to rethink what the federal government needs to do vis-a-vis the states, and not just shrinking government and regulation in general, which I'm all for, but also thinking anew about what the federal government needs to do. There are ways in which our federal system has made it harder for our country to respond to this pandemic because it's more complicated. There are more actors involved at different levels. and it makes it harder for action to be unified and fast. And I think, there are certain things that states and local governments should do, many of which have been largely taken over by the federal government. On the other hand, there are certain things that only the federal government can do, and maybe this will be a reminder of that. And if the federal government gets out of the business of all sorts of things it doesn't really need to be in the business of, and thereby is better able to do the things that only it can do, and that will be a very positive of this. I'm not predicting that, but I'll say it anyway in the hope.
Thank you. Ilya?
I wonder what kind of policies we'll even be considering a year from now, because we learn more and more about this disease and its progression and comorbidities and all these different things. The utility of masks, indoor versus outdoor. Is it all about indoor HVAC systems for a prolonged period of time, such that we don't even have to worry about, say, outdoor even concerts? Or is it that we simply will not have large-scale mass meetings, whether it be sporting events, concerts, revivals, or anything else? It's a shifting target, but certainly the policies that are either legally justified or warranted as a matter of cost-benefit analysis, that's a different array of policies now than 2.5, 3 months ago. And I'm sure that 3 months from now, come the fall, with school openings, come a year from now, even if there's no vaccine, there never was a vaccine for the Spanish flu, for example, 100 years ago, and yet in came the Roaring '20s, and it's like those 2 years never really happened, other than the people who sadly were no longer with us. So we've moved from one set of Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns to another, I think. But I do think that the flexibility of civil society and each level of government doing its proper role. For example, the biggest federal failure, I'd say, is in the CDC and the FDA, and that's what we really need to look at the federal level. Just like regulatory reforms might be more targeted at certificate of need laws for hospitals and occupational licensing and other things at the state level.
Mm-hmm. Ethan, let me give you the last word here.
All I'll say is thanks for having me and everyone else on today. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this has been a great conversation. We've talked a lot about how to create dynamic and flexible environments and what we can consider doing so that in the future we can more quickly respond to these kinds of events in a way that is structurally sound and allows us to think through the individual rights and create the balance that Jeff pointed out, so that we don't have that tension, but there's a mutual support system going on there. So I will wrap up our panel discussion for today. Please join me for the next panel discussion on individual rights and delivering education as universities struggle to balance safety, privacy, and the economic reality of the COVID-19 landscape. Until then, this is Christina Elson for the Center for the Study of Capitalism at Wake Forest University. Thank you.